That was really comfortable. Thanks, bro. Hard and balanced, but it was just like, I could have done 5. And 5 is actually what I was doing when I did 300. Yeah, 5 of that was when I did 300 low bar. So I think, yeah, I'm happy. All right, now I'm gonna warm up for low bar. Today is squat day. And I'm really looking forward to squat days because my legs, or my leg, is feeling good. I'm not gonna rush the process, but I feel 0 pain. And I believe that so I tore my leg doing a 270 kilogram squat. It wasn't a huge tear, but it was enough to hurt and stop me for a while. So I believe I'm 7 weeks post injury and 3 reps. This is my warm up. And this gives me a whole bunch of confidence to approach my real work, which is gonna be 240 kilogram low bar squats for 2 to 3 reps. You know me, when I give you a range, I'm always hoping for the top end of that range. So I'm hoping for 3 reps. But if I get 2, I'll also be happy. But either way, I feel like my strength is back, but I just don't want to be jumping back to 270 and 280. It was 270 kilograms that tore my quadricep. I feel like I'm strong enough to lift that now, but it's a process. Anyway, so that was my warm up. Now I'm going to do low bar squats, work up to my top step, and I'm going to talk to you about a few things. There's 2 issues that I want to be teaching you guys today. One of them, how to actively plant your feet into the ground and what to do with your hips and knees and stance to make sure that you're able to squat heavy, be balanced, be strong, you know, and that all goes hand in hand with staying injury free because weak things break, and when you're not strong, you're weak. And when you're weak, that's when things can happen. So a lot of the times when I'm working with people that have certain aches and pains, I look at the way that they're standing and the way they're approaching their movement, and it's like you're not even using your muscles, you're just going down and up. So that's what I'm going to be teaching you, starting from the stance and exactly what I do with my feet and how it interacts with my hips and my legs and how that interacts with how heavy I can squat. So now I'm going to show you those examples as I'm warming up on my first warm-up set for low bar, 70 kilograms. I'm going to show you what I mean when I say active feet in a squat. Okay, when I'm squatting, I don't just stand here passively with a heavy weight on my back and just go down and up. When I'm standing here, my muscles are actually on. Of course, I'm stacked and my knees are locked out and I'm not really using a huge amount of muscle. But what I'm doing with my feet is really, really important because that's going to initiate everything else that I do when I come down. So the first thing that I do with my feet is imagine I'm gripping onto the ground. So I'm holding on tight and externally rotating both of my feet, right? So my right foot is going clockwise, my left foot is going anti-clockwise, right? So I'm externally rotating and gripping onto the floor. Now, if you just externally rotate, why don't you come over here from front on, and you'll see what happens if I just externally rotate. And this is what actually happens, is you will kind of be up on the edge of your feet. That's not what I want. So if that's what happens, so you grip tight, externally rotate, and if your big toe comes off the ground, plant it down, right? So you're still grabbing onto that ground. Now, what happens if you're just passive, and this is where a lot of people stuff up, and this is where a lot of people's knees are out of control, is the knees kind of come in. When I'm screwing my feet into the floor, boom, that initiates that external rotation, which is an action of my glutes. So when you're just standing here and gripping onto the floor and externally rotating, you feel your butt is engaged. Now from here, what happens is because I'm externally rotating, it's going to position my knees so that they are pointing in the same direction as my toes, which is outwards, right? Now, what's the significance of knees out? Knees out allows room for my pelvis to achieve the bottom position and remain neutral. Okay, so why is that important? I'll tell you something. Last week I spoke a lot about butt wink, and I mentioned a thing called hip joint flexion and how we all have only a limited amount of hip joint flexion before we reach our end range. So this is called hip joint flexion. Now, this is knees straight ahead, right? Now this is knees out, right? Now, most people have a greater amount of hip joint flexion when we have our knees out. Well, that's called, this is outwards, is abduction and hip joint flexion. So we get a greater range of motion of hip joint flexion when we are abducted or when we have our knees out. So what does that mean? So measure how much hip joint flexion you have with your knees straight ahead. Now, outwards, most people have a few more degrees of hip joint flexion, which means we are able to access greater depth if we have an open hip position. So the greatest powerlifter of all time, Ed Cohen, has a cue, open your taint. So that means kind of like open your hip position here. And what we're doing is allowing room for that pelvis to achieve that bottom position and remain neutral so that we don't go into butt wink at that bottom position, right? So I talk about the pelvis like it's a bowl of soup. Don't spill the soup. If you are anteriorly rotating, you're spilling the soup out the front. If you're posteriorly rotating too much, you're spilling the soup out the back. We want a neutral pelvis or a neutral bowl of soup, and we want to maintain that bowl of soup all the way down without spilling it, right? So this is a reason why we want to be planting our feet and thinking about externally rotating, so when we drop down, it's going to allow us to achieve that bottom position and remain neutral, which is where everything is stacked from our pelvis through our spine in our neutral rigid position, and that's going to be the strongest position. So I want you to see exactly how I do that when I squat. I'll do a few reps so that you can see. So when I'm standing here, I'm not just standing, I'm actively standing. So look at my feet here. I'm gripping onto the floor and screwing my feet into the ground. This positions me in a way where I can have that open hip position. Rather than, not even thinking about it and letting the knees kind of knock in, and that I can feel my lower back rounding, which is weak. It's not stacked, and my hips are pushing back. And what I want is, so this is my open hip position, and this is when my knees come in, my hips push back even further, and it's not as efficient. It puts more load on my back, and it's not as strong. I don't get to use my quads as much, and that's what I do want. I want an equal amount of quads and hips in every single muscle possible. So that's one of the biggest things that you can do immediately. And the best way you can think about that is unloaded. So when you're warming up, so just stand here, relax. Now, grab onto the floor and screw your feet into the ground. Okay, so what happens here is I can feel it, my butt is on. From here, open hip position and sit. Okay, and that's how I like to warm up, and that's how I do every single set from start to finish. Next point on this before we continue. Ankles collapsing in. So this is an indicator that you're not screwing your feet into the ground or actively using your hips very well. So this is where you're quite passive. So what happens is, the ankles on people sometimes cave in, and the reason why they do, so the arches collapse, okay? So if your arches are collapsing and this is happening to you, usually that's because you're trying to access more range of motion and you're being blocked. So what do I mean by that? So we only have a certain amount of degrees of ankle joint dorsiflexion. So here's the test for how much you can dorsiflex. So for me, it's not that amazing. Okay, so that's me. So you keep the heel of your foot on the ground and you drive your knee forward. Okay, now that's how much ankle joint dorsiflexion I have. Now, the thing is, when I squat, that's pretty much all I need, is for my knees to come forward that much. Now, if I'm not positioning my hips correctly, I'll need to access a little bit more range of motion. So what I'll do to compensate is I'll let my ankles cave in so that I can get a little bit more range of motion so that my hips don't need to. So if you're doing that, if your ankles are caving in, that's exactly what you're not doing, is screwing your feet into the ground. There should be kind of like, even foot pressure, but slightly outwards. You should feel it kind of holding on this way. And if that's happening to you, your ankles won't be collapsed. The arch of your foot won't be collapsed. And this is where you're going to be able to use your strong hips rather than let the knees cave in and kind of like rest on the structure of your ankles maxing out on their range of motion and your hips maxing out on their range of motion. Okay, so watch me again. Now I'm going to do it with the bar. So I stand in my comfortable stance, which is just outside of, well, it's actually pretty wide, but this is my comfortable stance. Everyone's different. The first thing that I do is open my hips. So that I don't just come down, I open my hips. Boom. That action there. I'm gripping onto the floor. And my knees and feet are tracking in line from start to finish. So if you see, you'll notice when I warm up now, every set, that's what I'm going to be aiming for. If my knees are knocking in, they're not stacked, and that's weak, and that's exactly what you don't want to do. All right, so there's a good tip for you. boom, boom, boom. Easy. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? What a day for a 20-kilogram jump. Okay, you know, I should be able to do heavier than that for a triple, but this is rehab. That's how it goes. I'm slowly bringing it back. And I'm happy with that. 7 weeks after I tore my quad, I did 240 kilograms for a triple, had more in the tank. I'm on track, I'm on track. Now, I'm gonna go through the stance and a few things that you guys can do to make you better immediately. So, one topic that I wanna raise with this is knees knocking in a squat, so valgus knees. You may have heard of that with, you know, a lot of the science community are talking about it being actually no evidence to support that it's bad for the knees or anything like that. And in my opinion, I don't disagree with that. I don't think having the knees knocking in is necessarily the knees that are the problematic area, right? So there's a lot more that's happening when the knees knock in. And I would say it's more to do with what's happening at the hips and the back, right? So get this, the strongest position for a squat is where we have a combination of all of our muscles put together. So what does that mean? Low bar squat is typically hip dominant. So if I want to use my hips more, I want to use an open stance and push my hips back. The more I do that, so if I go really, really wide and push my hips back, so this is West Side Barbell. If you've ever heard of Louis Simmons, they teach very, very wide stance and it's all hips, 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 hips. They even teach that you shouldn't really be using your quadriceps that much at all for a squat. However, there is a difference with the way that they used to squat compared to modern day, and that is they were all equipped. So that's equipped powerlifting, and most people don't do equipped powerlifting, yet they're looking at equipped powerlifters and taking advice saying, oh, that's how they teach. I'll tell you right now, if you had to use a squat suit, I would say that Louis Simmons and Westside Barbell would be the best people to listen to for their techniques for powerlifting style of movement with the suit. So pushing into the suit, so pushing your hips back into the suit is where you get the most spring from the suit. However, we're raw, right? So we don't have suits to support us to push our hips back into, so we're pushing our hips back into nothing. So either way, the more you widen your stance and push your hips back, the more hips you use, but the less quads you use. I don't really want to use no quads, so therefore it should be a combination of a bit of hips, but also the more you bend your knees, the more you can use the quadriceps. So it's kind of like a combination of both, and it really depends on your proportions and where you're strong. But with me, what I want to do is position myself in the best way to be able to use as much muscles as possible. Now let's have a look at this. When I bring my knees in, or it's equivalent to bringing my stance in. When I bring my stance in, the only way I can get down, my ankles only bend so far, and then to get deeper, I need to push my hips back, 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 back. So that's equivalent to what happens when the knees knock in. Don't worry about where my feet are, worry about where that upper thigh bone is. When those knees come in, my upper thigh bone is here, and my pelvis doesn't have room to drop straight down. So here it can drop straight down. When my knees are in, it can't drop straight down. It needs to go back to be able to achieve that position. So therefore, when the knees knock in, it's creating a lot more load on the hips and back. All right, that's the end of all of the good stuff for this session. I'm just going to do hamstring curls now. So that's very boring stuff, but all I did was 2 sets. 1 set of stiletto squats, 200 kilograms for 3 with a pause, and 1 set of 3 on 240 kilograms. Is that enough work? Not really, but I'm rehabbing. And that's one of the biggest things with rehabbing is not doing too much volume. So I don't want to aggravate it, and I'm kind of just gently getting there. Now, here's my trade-off. I'm actually squatting 2 times per week. So I squat every Monday and Friday. So if I was only doing 1 session per week, I would probably want to do a little bit more volume than that. But that's something that I know is a great way of progressing, is do it more times when you're fresh, rather than, so do it more frequently, so multiple sessions. All I'm doing is 2 sets, 2 big sets in each session. Now that's, of course, it's very, very low volume, and that's actually, you know, if you've got torn muscles, what a lot of people do is they don't train at all. So for me, I'm actually getting very, very effective training in, and hopefully soon I'll be able to get a little bit more volume. And the goal is to get there in a few weeks' time, like maybe 3 weeks' time. When I get back to, you know, 260 kilograms on the bar, then I'll start increasing my volume. But for now, it's 1 top set of stiletto squats, 1 top set of low bar squats, and then I take all my gains and run. I don't want to push it too far. I don't want to walk away going, damn, I did a little bit too much. So now all I'm doing is hamstring curls, and then that's my session. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. And if there's anything else you want to see, of course, you know, I do programs if you want to be coached by me. That's what I do. That's what my business is. But let me just tell you, just because of this information that I'm giving you is free doesn't mean it has no value. This is the information that I had to spend a lot of money, spend a lot of time and effort and energy to learn myself. And it's yours for free. So I hope you enjoy. And I'll see you guys next time. Oh, not really. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I don't think it's very interesting.